There are few certainties in life, and I think those, as we have all lived through 2020, we certainly know that for sure. But you know one thing we can always count on? We can always count on the Liberal Party taking any opportunity they can to make it easier to exploit Australian working families. You see, despite their rhetoric, those on the other side have never been on the side of Australian working families. Most of the time they feel they need to hide it. They have to hide their contempt. They have to hide their true intentions. But you know, there are moments when they show their true colours. They show what they really think and what they really want to do. And there's a couple of times they thought they could get away with it. I was here after 2004 when John Howard won a majority in both houses, and the Howard Liberals thought they were permanent. They thought they were invincible. They finally had the confidence, therefore, to reveal they were not on the side of working Australians and that they never had been. And what did they do? They rammed through the extreme work choices law. Well, Australians got the message right away and sent the Howard government packing. Since then, the Liberals have been trying extra hard to hide their stripes. But you know, their stripes don't change. And now here we are again, a second time with a Liberal government that feels unassailable, that takes Australians for granted, that feels it's permanent, that thinks that the collective goodwill and trust in government that's generated by our shared response to the pandemic means they can get away with things that they never normally get away with. Well, once again, they will be proven wrong. You see, what the Coalition have misunderstood about these times, about how we have all pulled together through this pandemic, is that Australians have seen as clearly as ever what matters. Australians want good, secure jobs with fair paying conditions. Australians want cheaper childcare. Australians want to live in a country that makes things and supports local jobs, and they want to live in an Australia where no one is held back and no one is left behind. Australians want a government that's on their side. But what have they got instead? Well, Australians have a government that never delivers for anyone other than themselves, a government that isn't on their side, a government that will leave hundreds of thousands of Australians behind when it ends JobKeeper this month, that makes fundamental parts of life for working families like childcare just too expensive, a government of broken promises, sports rorts, dodgy self-dealing and $1 trillion of debt with what to show for it. A government that has overseen worsening job security and a government that cuts wages as they do with this bill. Now, Labor has set a very simple test. We would support this legislation if it delivered secure jobs with decent pay. But the government's legislation, even with the amendments it grudgingly made, still fails that test. I'll return to the provisions of the bill in a moment, but I do want to make the point that it doesn't have to be this way. Labor has set out our plan for more job security, better pay and a fairer industrial relations system. Because unlike those opposite, we understand that being in secure work means people can build a future for themselves and for their families. They can get a bank loan to buy a home. They can take leave when they're sick or need to look after those they love without putting their jobs at risk. This is a better deal on offer. Job security, better pay, a fairer system. Job security explicitly inserted into the Fair Work Act. Rights for gig economy workers through the Fair Work Commission, casual work properly defined in law, a crackdown on cowboy labour hire firms to guarantee same job, same pay. Pretty simple proposition. A cap on back-to-back short-term contracts for the same role. More secure public sector jobs by ending inappropriate temporary contracts. Government contracts to companies and organisations that offer secure work for their employees. And of course, we must tackle the gender pay gap. Labor's plan will require companies with more than 250 employees to report their gender pay gap publicly. Our plan would prohibit pay secrecy clauses and give employees the right to disclose their pay if they want to. And we will take action to address the gender pay gap in the Australian Public Service by we will ensure that the Fair Work Commission has strengthened powers to order pay increases for workers in low-paid, female-dominated industries. And Labor will legislate a right to 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave. The singular driving purpose of this parliament should be how we improve the lives of the Australian people. And that is why we make no apology on this side of the chamber for standing in the way of legislation that makes life harder for working Australians. And we make no apology for wanting casual workers to have the same basic workplace rights that the rest of the workforce rightly enjoys. You see, under Mr Morrison, job insecurity has worsened. Gig workers regularly get paid below the minimum wage in unsafe conditions. What does this bill do? In an act of political opportunism, this bill uses the COVID pandemic to entrench the epidemic of job insecurity. You see, what we know, COVID-19 didn't create the problems we're seeing in our society, the inequality, the low wages, poor working conditions. But what it did do is this: it shone a light. It shone a light onto realities that have been ignored by this government for every day they have been in power. And at a time where some in our lowest paid industries have borne the brunt of the pandemic, what is the thanks they get from the Morrison government? What is the thanks they get? The government thanks them, Mr Morrison thanks them, by allowing their pay to be cut. The thanks of a grateful Prime Minister. Casual workers. Well, we know casual workers carried this nation through the pandemic. You know who they are? They're our aged care workers, our hospitality workers, our retail workers, food producers, delivery drivers, and many of them are casual in name only, having worked in the same essential role for years, but without getting the sort of job security that is so fundamental to providing for yourself long-term and for your family. This bill will shackle these workers into the definitions and conditions imposed on them the day they started work. Under the proposed Section 15A in Schedule 1 of this bill, if an employer tells a worker they're casual on day one, this employment definition persists and prevails, even if through the performance of their role the worker has a set roster, a pattern of regular and consistent hours, and even if there's an expectation of ongoing and stable work. But true to form, the Morrison government is going even further. This section aims to have a retrospective application. The effect of that is those who were wrongly classified as casual employees remain shackled to that definition irrespective of the years of work history to the contrary. So you're not only doing people now, you're going back to do them over. This provision ignores real-world practice and turns back many years of legal precedent. When the courts expanded the rights of workers by examining the employment relationship beyond merely what was enclosed within the express terms inside a few pages, this bill seeks to take them away. Those opposite claim their inclusion of casual conversion provisions fixes the issue of insecure work. But you know what? You always have to read the fine print with this government, especially with this Minister for Industrial Relations. Because when you read these proposed changes closely, you will see an employer is able to reject requests for conversion to part-time or full-time work on so-called reasonable grounds, and the worker can only dispute a rejection if the employer agrees to go to the Fair Work Commission for arbitration. So, casual aged care worker, request conversion, employer says, no, I can't do that. And she or he has to go to the Commission for arbitration. Yeah, that's going to happen, isn't it? That's a good way to deal with it. No understanding of the disparity of power in the relationship. No understanding, or maybe actually they do understand. Maybe they do understand, which is why they draft these provisions in this way. On wage theft, well, this bill is consistent with the government's pattern of lagging behind the states. While wage theft provisions may at first glance look to be a step forward, if you're in Queensland or Victoria from the 1st of July, they're a step back. This bill would prevail over existing state legislation, so if you're in Queensland where fraudulent falsification of records is a crime, the bill overrides that protection. The Victorian and Queensland legislation has a 10-year maximum sentence. This bill will reduce that to 4 years. So for millions of Australian workers, the Morrison government is reducing their protections against wage theft, reducing the deterrence to engage in it. See, the bill criminalises wage theft in theory only and sets a bar so high that very few prosecutions could meet it. And we know that if wage theft is not prosecuted, it prevails and persists, most often in the form of taking advantage and exploiting our most vulnerable workers. Madam Deputy President, Australia's workers have demonstrated enormous good faith and solidarity through the pandemic by agreeing to greater flexibility in the workplace to help save livelihoods. These so-called JobKeeper amendments to the Fair Work Act were concessions made with the understanding that we were living in unprecedented times. They enabled businesses in receipt of JobKeeper to alter core aspects of an employee's work. They were provisions agreed to in good faith. Decent discussions, a decent position taken by the Australian trade union movement and those they represent. And what has this government done? What they've sought to do under Mr Morrison is to take advantage of that good faith and take away protections workers have fought for and won over decades. This government wants to let businesses that never even had a JobKeeper change, where workers... This government wants to let businesses that never even had JobKeeper change where a worker works or even what a worker does, not during this pandemic, for 2 years. And if that level of insecurity wasn't enough, Schedule 2 of this bill plainly legislates pay cuts, enabling an employer to ask the employee to work additional hours without payment for overtime. Really? I mean, in the face of that decency, this is what you do? At a time where work is scarce and JobKeeper and JobSeeker are ending, how many workers, you reckon, are going to be able to say no to that? Nothing in this bill seeks to increase wages or empower workers, and the enterprise bargaining changes in particular seek to take advantage of workers by masking true intentions in complicated legal jargon. Again, no surprise from this minister. We know that an agreement cannot contradict the national employment standards. In fact, agreements must ensure they reflect the minimums contained within those standards. What this bill seeks to do is allow employers to insert a clause which purports that they comply with the NES, but at the same time as letting them include clauses which do not meet that bare minimum threshold. And even though these clauses are illegal, they remain in agreements. And after all of that, the bill seeks to prevent a union stepping up and warning this isn't okay. Because if a union hasn't been part of a bargaining process before the agreement reaches the Commission, there will be no mechanism for the union to represent workers' concern. So all of this adds up to less scrutiny, less transparency, worse outcomes for workers. And if these realities weren't poor enough, it's worse still for workers engaged in major multinational projects, in constructions or FIFO workers. They face the prospect of being locked into greenfields agreements for 8 years without recourse. 8 years is a pretty long time. Pretty long time to be unable to revisit wage increases which have failed to keep up with the cost of living or address safety issues in the workplace. But it is what you'd expect from a government that considers suppressing wage growth to be a core objective of their economic policy. The catch cry of this pandemic was, we are all in this together. And at the height of the pandemic, Mr Morrison established working group processes designed to make it look like they were interested in what working Australians wanted. And they are trying to spin that this legislation is the result of working groups involving unions representing workers. But the entire movement representing working Australians opposes this bill. You know what the true spirit of this legislation is? It's not we're all in this together. It's you're on your own. And now, just as they did after John Howard's work choices, Australians will have a choice between a smug, tired party that governs for themselves and a government that is on their side, where no one is held back and no one is left us behind. An Australia with job security, better pay and a fairer system, but that will only come if we elect a Labor government.